So urban air transport, a new dawn for aviation. Or is it a false dawn? I mean, is it really going to happen? We heard the FAA administrator earlier this morning, if you were in here, saying that he does actually think it will happen in his lifetime. I think there's possibly some on the panel who will hope it will happen a lot quicker than that. But let's see. I mean, there is an issue because as populations in megacities continue to grow, the existing traffic situation will become increasingly demanding. Personal airborne transport systems and autonomous aerial vehicles capable of transporting people will quickly transition from being executive and VIP systems to being transport solutions potentially as popular as the car has been. Or will they? Let me introduce you to the panel first of all. If we start here by my side here is Guillaume Thibault, who is a partner in Oliver Wyman. Next to him, Ian Macbeth from Transport for London. Then Michael Cervenka from Rolls-Royce. And then Eduardo Dominguez Puerta from Airbus. So actually, if I could start with you, Guillaume.
It's better.
As Oliver Wyman, major consultancy in this sector of the industry, where do you see this as a market? Is it going to happen? How big is it going to be?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time for aviation, and for sure, my opinion is that it will happen. The question is more when and how. There are actually very strong consumer drivers behind this trend. As you mentioned, congestion, urbanization, the continuous request for speed in transportation. eVTOL clearly have an operating cost advantage, they have a grid advantage, and on top of that, what is very interesting to see is that since 2 years, since Young announced its 184 in Las Vegas, the acceleration has been tremendous. The distributed electric propulsion made important progresses. Even slower battery storage capacities are getting better. Structural concepts for vehicles are improving quickly. And all in all, today we have around 40 prototypes, latest being displayed yesterday by Rolls-Royce. So huge supply provided to the market with interesting coalitions and partnerships been also developed. We had the Uber summit a few months ago. So if you think about 2030, 2035, some studies expect between 25 and 50,000 vehicles. People speak about a market of around 30 billion euros. Out of which vehicle is only 20% of the value, which is a clear step change. So it's a very big market. At the same time, it will have to compete with autonomous ground vehicles. And if you compare in our forecast the expected size of the eVTOL market compared to the overall autonomous vehicle market, it will only be 1%. So it also relativize a little bit the expectation. So this is where we're going, and I think it's a good time to be in the market, with disruptive new business models to be invented, new technologies to be created, and coalition partnerships, because nobody will be able to address these requirements by itself.
Eduardo, you're head of urban air mobility for Airbus, and there's some interesting points in there. City Airbus we've seen as one of the great futures at shows in the last year or so. And you've also got Vahana, I think, which ties in with you, and the sort of software program, the booking program, which Airbus is getting involved with, which is Voom.
Voom.
So tell us a bit about how those, because when you're listening to the size of the market that Guillaume's talking about, it's pretty significant. So whereas before you think, why on earth is Airbus getting involved in something like this? I think those numbers kind of explain it.
Yeah, I mean, Airbus has traditionally been a big player in aeronautics. I think, as you were mentioning, Guillaume, we have realized that the platforms are not going to be the big driver. The big driver is going to be on the services. We also realize that the platforms will need to be enabled by air traffic management, by regulatory, by certification. And what we decided is actually 4 years ago to start working in all those different elements. You forgot to mention Altiscope, which is also a project that we do in Silicon Valley that is looking at air traffic management. And what we're doing now is we're trying to bring all those pieces together. Internally, we're going to change the rhythm. We're going to increase, I would say, speed. But actually also externally, I think we're proud to partner with a lot of players locally, because all these developments will happen in local markets. And especially with regulators and I would say governments, because from my point of view, technology is not the problem. Most of it exists. The big hurdles here are going to be public acceptance and the regulatory environment. And on this one, you mentioned EHang. I will not talk about competitors, but in Airbus we're committed to safety. We understand that the difference between the Wright brothers and today's aviation is 10 to the minus 9, which is the safety factor. Today when we jump into an aircraft, we don't think about whether it's going to be safe or not. And I think that is a very key point that we want to stress, because if for whatever reason there is any type of fatality in this type of market, the market will not exist and it will be locked down. So we know our responsibility. We want to contribute to a social, I would say, solution for a problem that is existing, and we believe that urban air mobility is going to play a key role in the future in urbanism and city planning.
Michael, if I can go to you, because we had the announcement from Rolls-Royce yesterday. You've got a lot of traction on it. For the benefit of everybody, just tell us what it is that you're doing and where you see it going from the Rolls-Royce angle. Just to point out, you're the head of future business propositions.
Yeah, and in that role, effectively, I look after all the future technology options for the company, so kind of beyond our current scope and horizon. So we've been looking at this space for quite a while, and I think the other point I would add to the comments that have been made is there's a big challenge also around the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So I think we recognise, like lots of people, there's going to be ultimately a big demand for all electric vehicles, particularly in urban environments with that last mile sort of megacity congestion. But we see that taking quite a while for some of the reasons that we've heard around noise, potential need for autonomy to get the prices down, but also the charging infrastructure and the physical infrastructure. And I think also a lot of the players, there's a massive step between being able to do an experimental prototype versus the capability to actually certify a product and make it safe and understand the aviation world. So our feeling was actually there's a different way of entering this market, which was around inherently we've got the capability to do safety critical propulsion. We've got actually a really nice sized gas turbine for this market in the Model 250, which is one of our existing helicopter engines. And so the concept that we unveiled yesterday was one that leverages that capability. So whereas the electric variants you'll have heard about typically will have an endurance of, I don't know, maybe 15-20 minutes. The minute you put a gas turbine in, suddenly we free up that design space, and the concept we unveiled can fly at 250 miles an hour and can travel 500 plus miles. We actually set that because clearly it doesn't have facilities in the aircraft, so probably having people more than 2 hours in that space is going to be the limiting factor. But I think that's a kind of interesting way of getting into the market, because it enables us to have a concept that can fly from existing fixed wing airports and helipads. The aircraft can take off and land vertically and conventionally. It recharges the battery from the gas turbine, so you don't need any new charging infrastructure. And because it's got that capability, it can justify initially the expense of taking a pilot on board. And actually our view is it provides an ideal platform to prove some of the autonomous capabilities. So it's likely, it seems to me, that the autonomy is going to need to be proven over perhaps less densely populated areas. So you want a platform that's actually useful to operate in more sparsely operated areas. So So that's really why we've kind of come at this and thought, well, how can we differentiate? How can we position ourselves to provide some different platforms? The other thing you may not be aware, just through the hall over there's a stand that we've partnered with Aston Martin and Cranfield Aerospace, Cranfield University, and that's a completely radically different concept, very much a high-end concept. And I think that the interesting thing this shows is, as Eduardo was saying, the technology is there, and the inherent flexibility of the propulsion system allows for lots of different types of aircraft and different concepts. So I think over time the market's going to fragment into different kind of vehicles, and the successes, I think, are not necessarily going to be just the ones who've got the best out-and-out concept, but those who are able to get the funding and industrialise and understand the safety and really hit the market at pace and get some penetration.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting space. I think the other thing I would say is 4-5-seat aircraft, I think, have got a really important role to play in offering a better transport system, but we don't necessarily see them as a mass transport mode. So part of the reason we're getting into this is it gives us a chance, we think, to create some excitement, some buzz, recruit some really brilliant people, but also act as a stepping stone for some bigger concepts that actually I think can become a more mass transport system. So these are inherently scalable. We can have disruptive approaches, particularly in regional aviation, that I think offer something, much more compelling than the challenges that we face today.
Mm-hmm. Michael, can I just confirm, is it only the propulsion system that Rolls-Royce are interested in, or are you looking much wider than that, almost as a holistic approach?
So it's a helpful clarification question, I guess. So ultimately we're a power and propulsion system provider. Our vision is around pioneering the power that matters. To do that on these kind of aircraft, you really have to understand the aircraft and the propulsion system together. The kind of traditional lines of boundaries between the propulsion system and the aircraft become a lot more blurred.
Yeah.
So even in the bigger aircraft, actually we do quite a lot of work figuring out what the aircraft requirements are to make us an intelligent customer, but it's even more important in this space. So Rolls-Royce is not planning on suddenly making aerostructures or doing, autonomous fly-by-wire systems. Actually, we'd love to have some partners and some investors, both from an airframe perspective and a supply perspective, to take this concept forward. But we're doing it really as a, building out that propulsion capability and really as a technology stepping stone as well.
Ian, head of foresight for TfL. I know it was something that a lot of people who travel in London regularly would wonder if there ever was one, but it's great to know you're doing it and doing a better job than your predecessors might have done. But so you got foresight, you're looking forward. Where do you see this happening from London? We've got trouble getting in on the trains, we have trouble getting across. Are we going to be able to land our new urban air vehicles on the top of the Shard or something? Where are we going to land? How is London going to have the foresight to welcome this new transportation system?
So first and foremost, there has been no foresight person before me. So I am the first foresight manager for TfL. It's probably worth giving a little bit of context around why TfL are here, because most people would expect us to be around about buses and mass transportation, those type of systems. But it's worth understanding that London is Europe's first megacity. The population today is around about 8.8 million. And we're expecting that to reach roughly about 10 million by 2030, 11 million by 2040. So we are the first megacity in Europe. We also have the most complex airspace and the most restricted airspace in Europe as well. TfL as an organisation, we're an executive agency of the Greater London Authority. My ultimate boss is the Mayor of London. And so we cover an awful lot of areas which people perhaps not generally familiar with. You'll associate us with buses, we're associated with tubes. We have around about 26 million trips per day on our network. That's a lot of people we shift around on a daily basis. But we go far beyond that. We're a road authority, a highways authority. So in effect we provide air traffic control for the surface. Every single traffic light in London is controlled by the building I'm in, 8,000 of those. We're an infrastructure provider. We look after tunnels and roadways and stuff like that. We're a regulator, and that comes up quite regularly. We regulate buses, but we also regulate taxis, and there's some stories behind that, as I'm sure you're aware. We're also a planning authority, so when it comes to landing and things like that, there's some interesting conversations to be had around there. And finally, we're the strategic authority, the strategic transport authority for London. So we have a very wide breadth of operations and an overall view of what may be happening. Now, aviation isn't traditionally something that TfL has been involved with, but what we have been involved with more recently is autonomous vehicles. So connected and autonomous vehicle activity has been going for about 3 years now. Next year you'll see some level 4 vehicles driving into London if the trials go correctly. We have a test bed in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park where you'll see those. So we are seeing that type of activity happening. And at the same time as the OEMs are looking at the CAVs, what we're also seeing is this interest in different mobility models. And this is where urban air mobility is starting to blur traditional lines between what's surface transport and what is in the aviation sector. So really interesting times for us. We're here to learn, really. We've been involved and we've been talking to a lot of partners. Many of the people that have been mentioned, Airbus and Aston Martin, have come to talk to us. We very much welcome those conversations about how this sector might develop. One of the key things that we've noticed is that, and I feel a bit like a lamb in the lion's den today, this is technology and commercial forum. What doesn't get discussed so much is society and politics, because urban air mobility has to get people behind it if it's going to get anywhere. So for us, safety is absolutely critical, and we welcome, when people talk about 10 to the -9 safety instances, that's, people are comfortable with that. Planes fly over my office every day into Heathrow. They don't drop out of the sky, but as Eduardo mentions, if there is a safety incident, that's really difficult from a political and a transport authority perspective. That's a key part of it. But also, we already use UAVs for inspection purposes and things like that. So they're already here. But what does 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 UAVs in the skies over London look like? What is the security, the privacy, the noise, the safety considerations? And whilst we fully recognise that the CAA have control of London skies, the airspace, it would be inconceivable in the future the Mayor would not want to have to say in an environment where UAVs are all around us, and that's a really key point for us.
Okay, so in that sort of foresight role, and you mentioned the planning areas for London, really, so under the Mayor's responsibility. We've done a lot with disabilities, for example, planning ahead about where you can put light bulbs or sockets and things like that. Are we actually now thinking, anybody planning has got to think about where could we land aircraft, or if we're not going to call them aircraft, what we're going to call them now, but are we going to be ahead of the way that's going to be a planning regulation, even though we're not flying yet? Because there can be nothing worse than, for example, inventing an aeroplane, but no one's invented the airport yet, because you'll be up there for a long time with nowhere to go. So do you think that's actually going to happen?
It's happening.
It's a really interesting point for us because we are a planning authority. And if you look at urban air mobility, aviation at the moment is constricted to airfields and airports. But urban air mobility, in particular, if you're talking about flying taxis, they could land anywhere, and all of a sudden all of London becomes an airport. And that's a very different scenario. And the planning regulations will need to reflect that going forwards. And that's one of the conversations we're beginning to have with the planners about, is the planning system fit for purpose in this new reality? The regulation side of it, where do you put noise and those type of things? Some of the most vociferous complaints we have about noise are actually from police helicopter operations. People complaining about them hovering over at night. So noise is a key issue for us. But also, we mentioned last mile logistics and things like that. the Mayor's transport strategy is very firmly focused on health and healthy streets, which is, we'd rather you walk or cycle that last mile. What does good look like? Do we really want pizza deliveries by air? So we have to think of the beneficial use cases going forward, and I think we've been working very closely with Nesta. I shouldn't say too much about that at the moment because the report is being released next Monday. There's a launch event. See Tris at the back there, he'll gladly give you details about that. But there'll be a vision in there for London, and what we set out is the need to understand what the beneficial use cases are going forward and to build a positive story for the public. There is some negative connotations with drones at the moment. How do we build that going forward, and what are the beneficial services that will pave the way for public acceptance?
Because that public acceptance is key, and we saw a lot of the negative views when Amazon, for example, talked about dropping a book into people's gardens and it was going to whiz over their heads and everyone was upset about it. Shian, what do you think? How do we get past this the people's objection to it? How do we change it that it's something for the good? Do you think we can manage?
Yeah, and to your point, I remember a study a long time ago regarding acceptance of helicopter pads, and there was this survey showing that the perceived benefit and the perceived disturbance of noise generated by helicopter was also related to the value perceived by these helicopters. And as people did not see the value for their own usage of helicopters, the perceived disturbance was higher. For sure, as Eduardo put it, social demand and acceptance is probably one of the key topics to address. You may probably remember this survey last year from UBS, where you could see that only 70% of passengers would be ready to undertake a pilotless flight. What is interesting in this survey is that you could see that these 17% were mostly young generation and highly educated people. So one of the answers we could provide to you is time. Let a generation pass and the perception of aviation change for this to move. I think the safety issue, the reliability issue is a cornerstone, and this six-figure gap that we have to bridge between drones, and we know the poor reliability of drones versus commercial aircraft is really the major challenge for the industry, and it will only require some millions of hours of testing time to make sure we did not miss any specific failure in the systems, which is also the paradox of eVTOL, because they need to be autonomous in order to ensure security, cost control, and you could not imagine myriads of eVTOL at the same time in a given city. But at the same time, we need to secure the manned phase before entering into the autonomous scenario. And I think the last challenge, which is obviously a very important one, is the way we manage airspace, which is a new field actually in the urban environment. There is no low altitude urban airspace management system today. It does not exist. Mm-hmm. So we need to create not only technological rules and scenarios to manage this airspace, but also to define the boundaries we want to, the frontiers we want to have. There will be physical limits for this eVTOL to evolve in this environment, but there will be also some limits relating to the environment, to the noise, which we cannot correctly perceive today because we don't have any drones flying over. And this will take time as well to be properly addressed and understood.
Okay. Can I just see if there's anybody got any questions or points they want to raise at the moment? No? Okay. I'd like to pick the panel up on this then, on that issue really of the airspace. We had the administrator of the FAA speaking earlier this morning, and we get the point, safety is a number one issue and it has to be proven by data that you've actually done it. Are you working already with the regulators on preparing how we get this space? What's it going to look like? What's going to happen to relatively low altitude flying in the general aviation market, for example, which often flies below 3,000 feet because of those sort of questions of controlled airspace above it? Mm-hmm. Is that kind of discussion happening, or are we going to squeeze that part of the aviation business out because we've got to make way for safe commercial lower airspace operations?
I mean, I think initially the airspace control of drones and those type of vehicles is going to be black box approach for little fleets. The next logical step is going to be the full integration with air traffic management, civil aviation, and I think in the future the third wave is going to be more the UTM, the unmanned traffic management systems. The biggest risk there is going to be the transition from a world where you have people controlling that traffic that will need to coexist with unmanned vehicles. I really want to make a distinction, and to your point, Guillaume, I think the eVTOLs are electric, vertical takeoff and landing. They don't need to be autonomous. And probably initially they will be introduced as manned or piloted. And then autonomy will be certifiable, and then we will make the next leap. And all of that hopefully will contribute to that public acceptance we were talking about. If you start talking about helicopters today, the direct operating cost of helicopters is high, and therefore is not democratized, and therefore not everybody enjoys being transported on helicopters, and therefore not everybody tolerates noise. It's all linked. If you multiply by 2 the utilization of a helicopter, you reduce the direct operating cost by 40%, and then it becomes economically more appealing to people and eventually more democratized. Autonomy will help, electrification, bring those direct operating costs down, with the hope that at some stage that will be at least democratizable. That's never going to substitute the rest of the transport means, but that is going to be something much more accessible. I think air traffic management is going to be the core, because it's going to be the heart of a network. And if you project yourself to the real future, where all those vehicles are going to be autonomous, that is going to be the key. Now, commercial aviation is also moving forward. People are studying simplified cabin operations for pilots. There is a big lack of pilots to cope with the future traffic. We are working more and more on autonomy on aircrafts, and that is also important for people to know. Autonomy in the air is much easier than autonomy on the ground. You don't have walking families with dogs, up in the air. What you have is a landing spot and a takeoff spot. And I think we have today enough technology to manage. So I think there's going to be an evolution, and it's a bit paradoxical to say, but disruption is going to be incremental. And through that different phases, society will understand, society will enjoy, and hopefully society will accept.
I think it'd be interesting to see where that takes off. Different countries will have different barriers or perceived benefits. Yep. Noise is also very much a question of perception. If you talk to people about helicopter noise, some love the fact you get that kind of thump, 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 thump. Others absolutely hate it. These aircraft are going to sound really, really different. So they're potentially quarter of the noise, but the noise signature is going to be different. So I think interesting to see as they start to come down in price and start to become more accessible, where does that tipping point happen in terms of people starting to accept it? And I don't think that will be uniform across the world.
I agree.
I think the other thing that's worth saying, we're all, of course, heavily involved in talking to the regulators about how do we make the platform safe, right down to the underlying technologies. So the people who understand this space know how to design component safety critical systems. The regulations are not in place to enable these aircraft to certify under current rules. We should be setting the bar really high and doing all of the really thorough work that underpins it. electrical machines. How do we understand the material properties of those, so we understand the degradation, failure mechanisms? All of those kind of underpinning things, I think, are absolutely critical to really make this successful.
I think, I do a lot with civil aviation authorities, and one message I get, whether I'm working in Africa or Asia or the United States, is that there aren't enough of us. We can't do these regulations in time. We're overworked as it is. When we're coming with something as disruptive as this, how are we going to fund and help and assist the regulators in something they don't know? So they've got to be part of, alongside. I mean, are you looking at mentoring, a regulator to write those regulations? Because it's a several years project, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, if you take the example of connected autonomous vehicles, we've worked very closely with the Department for Transport for a number of years, and we were instrumental in helping write the guidelines for the testing of those autonomous vehicles, and they will change over time because we don't know what the end state will be, so they have to be a constantly evolving scenario. And if you look at the world of surface transport, we're moving connected autonomous vehicles. We're very familiar with Pop-Up Next, but the automotive side is looking at 5G cellular vehicle to infrastructure communications. I have no idea if that's compatible with aviation communication standards, for instance. Probably not. That conversation hasn't really taken place. So there's multiple levels of things that will have to be discussed over time. And we as a local authority are not in a position to be able to do that, but we can convene and bring people together to start those discussions now. And that's a really clear thing, that we need to be started to make preparations for that from all sorts of side of things. I think in terms of scale, it's quite interesting to understand where mass transit sits and what the position of urban air mobility may be. We've just invested £14 billion in Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, and we have trains 200 metres long, every 2 minutes, delivering 1,500 passengers. You need an awful lot of flying taxis and mobility solutions to deliver that number of people in an intense urban environment. So urban air mobility has got to find its place in this ecosystem and how it integrates with the city going forward. And I think that's another conversation about where its place may be.
There was the point made as well, it works differently in different parts of the world. Dubai, for example, is arguing that it's well ahead on it, and their plan was, I think, 2020, probably now 2021, to actually be operating unmanned aircraft that would be working as air taxis. Are you watching what they're doing, and do you think it's actually going to happen? Will they be first, and do we then follow?
Well, I guess a few kind of observations. For this to be a viable business, I think we need it to be a viable business in more than one country. And so, while certain countries may lead, I would echo Eduardo's point that there's a risk in that if they set the barriers on things like safety lower, and then they have some challenges, that could have an impact on the wider industry. And please say, actually, the major airworthiness authorities, the FAA and the EASA, are very much in dialogue with each other, and they're very much looking for how do we have some common standards. I think, to your point, this isn't about do we completely rip up the rule book on all the existing certification. There's quite a lot that, with some subtle adaptation, you can now start to say how these aircraft could comply. And so actually some of the challenges on industry to provide the evidence base to say, yes, they can prove this system is inherently at that safety level. Electric, controlled aircraft inherently have some potential advantages. They build in greater flexibility, control, redundancy. So we should be aiming for a really safe product. We just need to be thoughtful in how we do that and engineer it from a systems point of view, build in the component reliabilities and the system redundancies. So I think we'll get there. I think it's not a kind of magic bullet. Suddenly we're going to see all the regulations in place in 2 years from now. Yeah. And probably, like all these things, as we go through, more companies getting involved in prototypes and finding things out, that will help shift some of the regulations as well. Yeah. But I think for me it's really important actually we have some common standards, and it sounds like the two main regulators who largely regulate the global aerospace industry today are very much with that mindset.
Yeah, if I may add to this, we're in touch, of course, with people in Dubai and places. Every time cities or countries have upcoming events like Olympic Games, like expos, they are really willing to show their capability to innovate, which is great because that pulls the whole system. But I think they're also conscious that it's not a startup without having a deep experience in aviation, certification, etc., that is going to put that service in place. So they always link back to the big OEMs and people that they trust, because you have a track record, because you have operated fleets, you have certified different numbers of aircraft, and at the end of the day, they're also willing for us to help and support. For me, there's a sentence I like very much, which is before there's no market, there's no competition. And I think this is where we stand today. When I look at what you guys are doing, we're potential future partners. We cannot compete for something that is not existing. And we need to write the rules, and we will probably need to hold hands together with regulators, because it's writing a new history. We will probably need to develop industrial standards with the rest of the ecosystem, so that we can plug different vehicles, we can operate, etc. And at the end, we need to create the access to that market altogether. If we don't do that collectively, that will happen, but later. And maybe the FAA administrator is right, we will not see it in his lifetime. But if we really cooperate, and if we really look for those positive cases that we can show to society, and we work all together, I think at the end the market and the potential is there, and we will be able to enjoy an additional and complementary way of transportation for city planning and urbanistic.
And for me, if I can just briefly, I think that partnership's really important, because actually I think there's a huge amount of innovation that's being driven, and something that big corporates sometimes struggle with is how do we pull through that innovation and the new ideas and the different ways of working. So actually this space is ripe for some really rich collaborations where we take things differently, and yes, we've got the checks and balances in place, but we're also a bit more open-minded about how we go about things. So I think there's a real opportunity for different kind of partnerships, and that'll benefit the whole of aviation in the way we should do things in a more agile, entrepreneurial manner.
What interesting, sorry, I'll just make this point on there. When you're talking about we're disruptors in this. In most other industries, the disruptors come from the back of a garage somewhere. We saw it happening to a fair amount with the drones. I mean, every university in the world, I suspect, has now got a drones department creating drones. That is not commercial air transport that we're on here. Are we going to see the disruptors being the Airbus, Boeings, the Rolls Royces and so on? Or are there opportunities for people to bring the price down because they've not got the baggage? Will we see the disruptors coming from the universities and the garages to be able to work in small but busy, crammed towns in the Czech Republic or France or Saudi Arabia or wherever?
I mean, even the big OEMs, you mentioned Vana, you mentioned City Airbus, we have been doing that on the edge. Meaning, in the Silicon Valley, 9 hours difference from the mothership, with 50 people team. That is a garage. The difference is that you don't need to raise money because you are backed by a big OEM. But the way those technologies are being developed are really on an agile and entrepreneurial style. Because it's usually difficult to convince a CFO of any business case where the market doesn't exist. Now, some of those guys that have been entrepreneurial and that have developed those prototypes and demonstrators will of course get finance, and eventually will get back by OEMs or by automotive industry, who is very active as well on this space. So traditionally our competition is the big names, I think we are much more aware that competition is not going to come just from the traditional ones, but from the rest of the space, and that's very clear.
I think from our perspective, we're very used to that disruption to established models. A lot of our regulation is 150 years old. It was never designed for modern development. And when you talk about disruptors, these people are coming from completely different sectors. If you think about dockless bikes, completely different world from aviation, but huge Chinese financing going into these dockless bike solutions, and they're popping up in the tens of thousands in cities all across Europe. How do regulators deal with that? That's completely different. If you're on the West Coast of the States now, venture capital money is flowing very freely.
Yeah.
Electric kick scooters. Who'd have believed an electric kick scooter could raise $100 million worth of VC backing just a couple of years ago? So very, very different people, different business models and mindsets coming to bear. So even though we're not necessarily in aviation per se, we're seeing these disruptors on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments, opinions? Over here, please. Thank you.
Mike Bromfield from National Transport Design Centre, Coventry University. How will we ensure joined up thinking here? Because it's great to have a flying taxi, but we need to integrate with transport infrastructure for the whole travel experience. Would the panel like to comment on that?
I mean, from an Airbus perspective, we are hiring people that we never had in our company. We used to have aircraft architects. Now we're hiring real architects. We're hiring urbanists. We're hiring people that have capabilities on city planning, on artificial intelligence and data analytics. And we're doing that because we believe that the integration with the overall network and the rest of the city is going to be the key. We also believe that the starting block is going to be the airports, because to the point of public acceptance, airports are already publicly accepted because we all go on holidays and we all tolerate a certain level of noise because we benefit from it. So for me, that is going to be part of the spear. Then the second point is, where do you land? And this is where I believe that places like London, where you have a river, that usually can be used as well, and in terms of safety and perception, is not bad. Places that have a sea, shore, I think those type of routes that could have enough volume, those could be starting routes to be open. So to your point, of course, you cannot operate urban air mobility aseptically from the rest of the system. It needs to be fully embedded in it. And that will require new capabilities and new competences in companies like ours.
I think there's also an element of us working more closely with government. So in the UK, for example, the Department for Transport, currently they would say they have real skills and capabilities, but they're still quite siloed in different transport modes. And they're very aware of the need to start joining across that. And I think part of what we have a role to do is to help shape that and understand what's the art of the possible. Because if they're planning kind of big infrastructure projects that have got to last decades, we need to kind of help them think through, well, is that going to be fit for purpose? What might a future transport system that has to be intermodal to be successful look like in 20, 30, 40 years' time? Not least because it might completely disrupt the business case for some big land-based infrastructure project they're about to launch.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to see on the long run how deep will be the transformation to the transportation industry, because it used to be that the industry was quite vehicle-centric, and as in any industry impacted by the digitalization, because this is the topic, the impact is that the business needs to be consumer and passenger driven, with a decrease in value in every transactional business model where the value comes from the sale of the vehicle or the setup of an infrastructure. What is more worrying is when you think back at what happened in the industries that were disrupted by digitalization, where we saw some big platforms emerging to capture the relationship with the client, let's say, to propose mobility as a service and a full multimodal journey with nice experience. And when you see the profitability of these players today, none of them makes money because they're all pursuing the scale. So the question that you may ask as well is, on the long run, will the value move from Airbus to startup, but also why this value will not move from companies to the consumer?
Yeah.
With a decrease actually in the wealth of this industry overall, as we could see in many industries.
I think there's an interesting case with airlines.
Yeah.
Airlines have had traditionally a positive impact on the GDP of cities. That positive impact was not on the P&L of the airline. And this is why airlines were subsidized at the beginning, because they were contributing to increase value for a society, and the society had to support the development of that industry. At a moment in time, that reached a critical mass where those subsidies were no longer needed. And I think possibly that is also going to be a development on this space, where cities are going to invest and be entrepreneurial as well, because there is also a flexibility value. There is also a lack of infrastructure investment. When you look at the budgets that you guys manage, you know, a kilometer of air is probably much cheaper than a kilometer of a tube. And the flexibility that you might get with it is also interesting. So I think to the point of the economics, today we're all learning. We know that there is something. We also know the Moore's law and how technology cost decreases, and we expect to see this evolving in a positive way. But that shift of value and the management of that value chain and the ownership of that customer is going to be the key game.
I think there's an interesting bit around regional in this space. We know that if cities get bigger and bigger, they get more and more productive. So one way is you grow a city. Another way, which Europe and lots of other areas do really badly today, is better connect different regions. So if you could have lots of cities in the UK where actually they're within commuting time, suddenly you transform the overall capability of the country. So the business case there is much about GDP and competence of the country, and spreading the wealth, the north-south divide, etc. How do we facilitate that happening, and how do we make sure the kind of the value proposition is there and we understand that?
I suppose I should say something about north-south divide on that point. I would hesitate to say that my father-in-law actually worked for Rolls-Royce many years ago. In Derby, so I'm from the north. Obviously, I work in London, and London is the economic heartbeat and it's a showcase for the UK. So, if you can do things in London, you can do them anywhere in the world. I'm also very aware that Coventry has a long and illustrious past with not only aviation but automotive as well. And I think the way that the automotive industry is having to change rapidly at the moment is really interesting. They're having to become much more agile than previously was the case. And if you think a couple of years ago, would it be conceivable that German cities were putting diesel bans in place with the strength of the German automotive industry? No. And now you see people like Jaguar Land Rover in the West Midlands having to change their powertrain very, very rapidly, very quickly, in response to what mayoral objectives are setting out. So I think actually aviation has got quite a lot to learn from the automotive space in terms of agility and the way that society is changing quite rapidly. And the power of mayors to actually dictate what happens in their area shouldn't be underestimated. Now, we work very closely with the CAA and NATS and so on, but if there's a proliferation of things in the air, it would be inconceivable that the Mayor of London wouldn't want to say in what happened is. Now, if we are becoming involved in that, yes, we need to finance it. We need to look at taxation, enforcement, regulation, all those kind of things that go with the system. And those are the sort of things we also need to explore. But the automotive sector is going through a big change at the moment. I think aviation is going to be disrupted in a similar way.
I think another interesting challenge that operator will face is that the granularity of the market shift from countries to megacities. And the challenge raised by this change of granularity is that city which compete now with one another are not characterized by a single regulation. If you want to achieve a scale effect, how do you combine together cities in different countries with completely different social, administrative and legal networks? It's not an easy game. Zoom made it very well moving from Sao Paulo to Mexico because they share same patterns.
Yeah.
But maybe in the future we could also imagine a situation where there would be regions, I would say a Chinese environment, which is big enough to support specific standards, a North American one, a European one, etc. But the question of how do we approach cities as a single market, much more relevant as countries, is a big one in terms of organization, in terms of market capabilities, and also in terms of regulation, obviously.
For sure.
Question at the back there, please.
Hello all. In 1920, I believe 30% of the population lived in cities. As of now, we have a little over 50% of our population worldwide living in cities. And by 2050, we will have 70% of the world's population living in cities. I am the CEO of GoFly, running the GoFly Prize, which is a multi-million-dollar international incentive competition where we have invited the world's innovators to create a personal flying device. It's sponsored by Boeing and have 20 different aerospace partners along with us. And so my question for you, apropos to what you were just saying about cities, is how do you all believe that it is best to integrate new flying technology development in transportation? And do you all believe, as we do and our partners do, that it is absolutely necessary given the demographic transformation that we are seeing around the world in terms of urbanization as well as decrepit infrastructure around the world?
I mean, one activity that is happening today in Europe, and maybe it's not that visible and it's not that shiny like the platform that you're going to put out there for design or Vana or City Airbus, is the European Innovation Programme is fostering cities to study how urban air mobility needs to be integrated in the infrastructure and in the future planning. And that is a novelty. That is new. Very few cities in the world had already considered how to integrate it and how to plan for the future. And the most interesting thing about that program is who is signing those manifestos, which is the European Commission, which is EASA, European Safety, Eurocontrol, traffic control, the governments, the regions, the city, and the industrial partners that are present in that city. And that is happening as we speak. This year it happened in Hamburg, it happened in Geneva, it happened in Ingolstadt, where we co-signed with Audi, which shows that linkage. Hopefully one day might happen in London, Amsterdam, Madrid. That is the beginning, because policymakers, because industrial partners, because regulators, we need to think all together. And unless there's a clear demonstration of that willingness, that will never be a reality. So that is happening as we speak. New Zealand is today also flying those type of vehicles and is moving forward regulatory space to really regional distances beyond the visual line of sight. And you know, the beauty about regulatory systems is that they have influence on each other. And if you're able to certify something in a place that is respectful, that might have a political influence on another different system that will also have another influence. And little by little, I think you know, all regulatory bodies will converge. So to your answer, yes, GoFly. It's a good price. Good luck with it. Talk to us if you find a nice design. But just looking for the vehicle is not going to bring it. The vehicle is just a small piece on the system.
Yeah, I'd echo that because I was out in Sofia a couple of weeks ago at the EIP conference where we were talking about with cities, and we were talking with Hamburg and Toulouse and Bordeaux, other cities who are considering these type of challenges. What I would say is there's a gentleman just two rows in front of you from Nesta, who we've been working very closely with on the Flying High Challenge. Exactly the same questions about what we should do. And we're looking for funding to go to the next steps on that. So I really would, if you've got lots of money to spend, talk to him.
Yes.
But yes, I mean, it is something that we do need to do, and I absolutely agree with Eduardo's comments. Cities need to come together to have those conversations.
Yeah. If I may, there is a very traditional sentence. It says, be careful with what you think, because it might become your words. Be careful with what you say, because it might become your acts. And be careful with your acts, because it might become who you are. And here we are, not just thinking, we're chatting and talking. And we're also flying. So be careful with what happens, because it might happen. And I think that is a clear message that everything requires an evolution. But as soon as you gain momentum, and as soon as there is a real willingness and a societal benefit, things happen.
And I think that's a lovely way to end this panel. And Guillaume, Ian, Michael, Eduardo, thank you very, very much for being with us. I found it fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you did too. Please show your appreciation.
No.